All right, guys, welcome back to Rough Cut Faith. We are, that was the smoothest one so far. So we are continuing on our conversation with finishing up Matthew, right?
Yep.
And like we've talked about, I think we talked about it last week on Rough Cut. We certainly talked about it during the post-service stream and time of reflection, where there's this weird combination of, in this section of Matthew, it's like a combination of frenetic pacing with contemplative high points. There's very clearly, that from the beginning of Matthew straight through to the end, the illustrations and the thesis statement remain the same throughout the entirety of it. But now we're in this point where you're kind of going from event to event to event to event to event. And that's where you're heading this week with covering a buffet of options when it comes to this.
So we had, when Mike and I had talked through how did we want to come back and wrap up Living Kingdom, and we made the decision to move through it a little more at a quicker pace than we had approached Matthew up to this point. When we got to, after where Mike ended in verse 46 of chapter 26 this last week, from 47 through the end of chapter 27, so it's 47 through 75, and then 66 verses of chapter 27. There's a lot of these little vignettes, these little scenes that you just see happening, and it's easy to get into it and break them apart, but we felt like the story is served best entering us into this Good Friday and Easter celebration of just that rapid pace of, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Because we've had so much time with Jesus all the way up to this point that it's okay. And the content of what goes on, some of the moments in here are really important, right? Jesus before the high council, and the reason they finally, they can't figure out how they're going to actually, get him to be guilty, worthy of this charge, to get rid of him, pardon me. And it eventually comes down to what seems to be almost a random comment from the high priest, because they couldn't get people to agree on it. And then they had two witnesses. All the accusations, they're like, okay, what? Come on. They're bringing in witnesses and bringing in witnesses. Finally, they get two to say, well, he said he was going to destroy the temple. And Jesus is quiet. He doesn't respond to him. And then finally, the high priest is like, well, are you the Messiah or not? Are you the Son of God or not? And Jesus is like, it is what you said. You said it. And then all of a sudden, everybody's tearing their clothes. And we don't need anything else. You've all heard it. We're all witnesses now. And that exchange, I think, is really significant. There's a lot of prophecy that's fulfilled in and through there. But, it really comes to the point of Jesus, why he was crucified in the eyes of the people. And what did Jesus think about who he was? And then I think a lot of the other elements that we'll look at, they're very much the human story of the disciples in that moment of what Mike talked about this last week, of the chaos and the confusion finally hits and they start to scatter. And even Peter tries to hold on, but he still scatters.
It's like when they see that they're not fighting, that they run.
Yeah.
They were, and I thought, I almost wanted to go into that, but it was already long enough. But the fact that they didn't scatter immediately. Yeah. Well, they were asleep, so they're groggy, and there's a crowd, and everybody walks up, but they're ready to fight, and I think that's significant. That when it was clear that they weren't going to fight. Yeah. Then they ran.
They weren't gonna die fighting.
Yeah.
Right.
And Jesus is like, no, this is not the way.
Yeah.
That's a real fascinating thing to lean into and start to consider is
And when you see the responses, like these vignettes, I think we talked about this maybe last week or the week before, how when you're watching a movie, the rising action gets quicker, like the edits are faster. There's it earlier on as they're unfolding the story, it's a little bit longer. You have these conversations, and then the action just moves faster and faster. That happens literarily too, and that's like what we see here. We're moving faster and faster after chapter 24. 25 just is like boom, 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 boom. There's this action happening. But it's a lot, you alluded to it already, it's a lot of responses of the people. So Jesus just staying quiet and saying, not even answering them directly, yeah, you've said it. You know, are you the Messiah? Well, you've said it. Like, that's their response. This is the religious establishment's response. In the same way that the unnamed woman in Simon's house was a response to Jesus, in the same way that Judas was a response to what Jesus said, who he was and what's going to happen. Peter responds. The disciples respond. Now we see the Sanhedrin responding. It's everybody is like responding to what Jesus has already said for the last 24 chapters.
It's interesting, even in the arrest of Jesus, going like, "Hey, listen, I was in the temple every day.
Yeah, you could have.
Why didn't you come and get me there?" Like it's almost like he calls out like the whole reason why they said, "Well, we can't take him in the temple because we're afraid of a riot." And so Jesus is like, "Well, why didn't you take me there? Don't worry, you're doing this because it's fulfilling prophecy." You know, this is like you're not surprising me. You know, again, it's like, whoa, hey, hold on a second. You know, and then he's like, he's quiet. For the most part, he's quiet. And that's
even with Pilate. No matter where he is, he's just being quiet now.
It's definitely, it enters into that process of like he's resolved.
Like the story is being told now through the responses of the individuals or the crowds to him. Jesus isn't driving the narration now. It's the respondents.
The story has been written. You know. So, and I think that's the stuff that as we come to it, this is the last week that we will enter into this story before we hit Good Friday and Easter. And in Easter, we're going to do chapter 28. We're going to look at the resurrection and the commissioning of the followers of Jesus, right? But the resurrection of Jesus and the commissioning of the followers of Jesus. But how do we, as we come to these kinds of passages, we've talked about the familiarity of this. I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation in and around what does it look like for us to engage with a familiar story in a way that moves us deeper into a sense of worship. What are your thoughts coming into what could be seen as those quick little snippets, the quick pieces of the stories? How do those shape the way that you see God and worship God just as individuals?
When you look at each one of the four gospel accounts, each one is hitting it from a very specific perspective. They're telling the same story, just from their own point of view. And that when you can allow the individual stories to be told, it gives you a better idea of these are the high points, these are the themes, these are the points of emphasis that you can hold true, even if through this lens you're only getting part of what is the grand narrative of Jesus's life, ministry, last week, death, burial, resurrection, all of that stuff. And so I think in a situation like this, you can take these pieces and use these pieces, these different chapters, these different vignettes, these different stories, and continue to look at them through the lens of what is foundationally true. What do we know to be true about the character of God and the character of Jesus, and drawing those things out, that is a different kind of study from a pure academic study of the text. And I think in situations like this, reading them as a part of the story really does matter, not isolated from each other and hyper analyzed separate from one another, but this is the whole narrative that we have. This is a part of the narrative. These different things are happening. What's the connective tissue?
Yeah.
And when you hit that point of what's the connective tissue, that's where it becomes a very easy on-ramp to start to really consider the things that, like I said, you hold true about the character of God and the character of Jesus.
Yeah. I feel like more than the other three Gospels, maybe it's because we've spent so much time in it, but I feel like Matthew draws me as a reader into the story more than the other three, and demands a response from me. And I can't put my finger on why that is. Like, as a literary document, I've read stories that draw me in, and then some stories I'm like, oh, that's a cool story, but I'm not part of this. And I think Matthew, to me, feels like it's pulling me into this, including me in the mix, and demands a response.
Well, I think to that point, to piggyback that and to grab the ball off of you and take it a little bit further down the field, it's because this book embraces the human element to the degree that it does. That gets coupled with the thesis statement, Christ as King. And with those two things combined, it forces the reader to answer the question, Christ is King, how does that affect how you live? What are you going to do with that? And allowing the principles and the truths and the teachings and the ways of life to be resonant and to hit and to bear an effect and all of that kind of stuff. With this direct lineage, it really does, it allows for something a little bit more experiential than just looking at a timeline of events.
Yeah, there's things that, as I've thought through it a little bit, that as Matthew says, this is done to fulfill the scriptures. This is done to fulfill what was said before. And to see the kind of kingdom that Jesus has called his followers to go, this is what it looks like to live as the people of God. You really do, in some ways, see the clash of kingdoms that we talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. Like here in these two chapters, that like it isn't just to follow Jesus, the ways of Jesus, will put you at odds with different systems and power structures. And yet the way that Jesus goes about it, the way that he carries himself at his point of being most vulnerable, as you brought up this last week, is it's just very fascinating to look at. It's very it draws you in, because we've literally, at least in my mind, having come out of the minor prophets into Matthew, it's like, ooh, okay, this is what Jesus has been, this is what God has been doing, this is what Jesus has been calling us to. And then you see, you just see the responses that it's not just the clash with the religious folks, it's the internal conflict that Judas has. It's the response of Pilate going like, I don't see anything wrong with this guy. Like, it's not our laws that are there. But he's also he's also in charge of managing a political region, and he doesn't want chaos, right? And so he's like, I'm just going to go with the flow on this one, despite even his wife coming and showing up and being like, hey, don't have anything to do with this guy. I had really bad dreams about this last night, and he's like, I'm not going to listen to her. I'll deal with the conflict in my home rather than the conflict in the city. And so you get this back and forth going on. And I think the thing that, and I don't want to get too far into the crucifixion and that, but I think the thing that I've wondered as I've kind of looking through this is Jesus is condemned and then taken right into the garrison and beaten and mocked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I thought about some of the ways that they would parade a captured king, and thought about the humiliation that Rome would inflict on someone that was a representative of another kingdom.
That's an interesting point, because for so much when you talk about this section of scripture and like when you start getting into why this time, why this place, all of that kind of stuff, and Rome being kind of the capital of the world at this point in time and all of that. But if you look at some of the specifics in the culture, some of the specifics in the traditions, how they did things, systems, all of that, I really do think that there are deep thematic points to consider when looking at this happening at this time and this place, and how they treated him, and kind of looking at that at a deeper level.
Yeah, even the mockery of the sign on the cross. Here's the King of the Jews.
Yeah.
It's like it really does draw me into this thought of, like, if Matthew is written, in the 50s, which is what I think realistically for me, that's where my conviction is at. Some would say maybe in the 70s, but I think it's in the 50s. So Rome is still, like, they're still the dominant empire.
Yeah.
And so the things that they're describing about what Jesus is going through would have been in the back of the mind of so many of the believers, going like, oh yeah, I know, we know what crucifixion is. We understand that.
We know what this looks
like. Yeah, we know what this type of torture looks like. We get it. And so that framework is, it just, as I read through this, I am drawn into, there's not just the clash between Jesus and the people of Israel. There is a much broader, like, there is a juxtaposition that the reader would have seen between the ways of Jesus and the ways of Rome. And I think, as I'm thinking out loud, which is sometimes dangerous, but it makes me wonder, again, what does the vulnerability of Jesus look like compared to an empire of power and fear and dominance, versus the ways of Jesus? And what did it look like for the early church to look at, how Jesus responded in the face of such oppression? What did it look like? Why draw out the attention to Peter's reaction with the sword, and then Jesus is like, nope, we're not doing it this way. Like, is it necessary to the story? Like,
that was something that when I was listening to Tim Mackey with the Bible Project guys, they were talking about, I was listening to something that they did several years ago, but in researching what this cup meant, I ran across this podcast, and they were talking about the whole wide gamut of it. But he mentioned, and I thought it was so fascinating, that Jesus, in the same way that when God removed a hand of protection in the Old Testament with those passages, then the consequences came, and Jesus was standing now in the place in between Rome and Israel, in a sense. Like, that was the image that we were getting, that Rome would come against Israel, and Jesus was standing in that place. Israel still continued to not follow, and so they fell. But there were multiple threads coming together at Christ's death, and one of the physical threads was Jesus, as King of the Jews, taking the punishment that Rome was going to bring against them and saying, this is how my kingdom lives. Like, because he had to die in order to defeat death. And it seemed like death seems final, right? That's what we look at, as death is final. But in order for Jesus to defeat death, he had to experience it and then come back from it. And so he showing his followers that, no, this is the kingdom. This is what we do in the kingdom. We die. We actually experience the death because there's something more than this life. And so we don't have to fear the death. We no longer have to fear the death. I've gone before you and then conquered. It's like paving a way through death into life. It's a fascinating thought process, but as you like what you brought up, as you look at that, everything is a juxtaposition. And even what happened, what Jesus prophesied would happen in chapter 25 or 24 this fall of Jerusalem. Everything would be destroyed by Rome, because there were three different factions, different rebellious factions that started a rebellion against Rome, and they all started fighting Rome in separate ways, and they were all based on these people saying, well, I'm the one then. I'm going to be the Messiah, which is what Barabbas was. Barabbas was a revolutionary. He was somebody who was fighting Rome. And so even in that image of Jesus or Barabbas, it's like, which one do you want, Israel? Do you want this Jesus who's given himself up to die? Or do you want this Barabbas who's fighting Rome, who's using physical power to fight physical power? And Israel overwhelmingly says, Barabbas. We want the one who's fighting physical power. And so even in that choice that they made, you see Israel saying, no, we choose our strength over this
resistance.
death. We choose resistance over peace.
That and from a very humanistic standpoint, I think part of what is being drawn out here, just essentially to say the same thing you did, just in different language, there's nothing new under the sun, and there are tones and actions that are captured here in these moments where it's sobering to read it and to say, oh, this is a human thing. That's part of one of the low-key things that you guys are accomplishing, that I'm watching you guys accomplish throughout the course of how you're hitting this, is there are a couple of sticking points along the way, and they look different for each section, but there's a variety of them. Reading so-and-so as the villain, reading this group as the villain, misreading God's wrath, different things like that, where if you're saying, okay, we're not going to sit here and we're not going to get lost in fighting this mindset or this thought process or whatever, we're just going to say, okay, get in the car, we're going through the story. And you're going through the story and you're hitting it, okay, so this part, this here, is plugged into the rest of the story. This is the context around it. This is where it fits fully, and you keep moving forward. Kind of low-key does exactly what you're not stopping to put emphasis on, but it's showing the context and thus stating nobody's the villain here. Or God wasn't just angry and needed somebody to take it out on, or any of the other sticking points. But along the way, we see a variety of very human responses that if we look at in our modern context, the people involved may be different, the trappings may look different, the situations and circumstances may look different, but humans still react in a very similar sort of fashion. And I think that what you're seeing here with Peter and that whole line of, I would include everybody like falling away, and even into the points where Jesus kind of has to prove who he is to the disciples and all of that kind of stuff. I think all of that is addressing the very real humanity in the people that are involved, that are following Jesus, because they may be following Jesus, but they're not Jesus. They're still man. And so part of looking at the well-rounded picture, the full scope of it is, yes, these were the people that were following Jesus, but they still, in the midst of chaos and the midst of tragedy and not knowing which way was up, acted out or reacted out or went off of instinct. And these are the very same principles that Jesus is outlining here that we get in different ways elsewhere in his teachings, or post this point continued on by other authors.
Yeah, I don't think we don't see anything different as we move through the New Testament. Like that Paul didn't add to this.
That's part of when I grew up in the faith and finally took, like, when I really started to understand the full depth of, okay, so this is where I'm at in history, this is biblical history, these are the people that are involved, this is where they were at in the world, and kind of started building out the timeline of this is how it all kind of happened and all of that. When I first started, and then still there's parts of me that I'm like, oh, the loudmouth that sticks his foot in his mouth and is super passionate about things. Oh yeah, I can see myself in that person. But with Paul, he goes on to take what Jesus taught and puts it into language that's graspable and adaptable to the people without forsaking truth at all. But giving it to people in ways that it makes sense to them. So to that very point, I think we get the meat and potatoes in its purest sense here, and then we see those taught elsewhere and redefined and all of that kind of stuff.
I think that's what makes. This may open up another can of worms that we don't have the time to get into, but I think that's what makes the Bible unique in the whole scope of Holy Scriptures. Because there's all the Vedas, there's so many different things that go into Hinduism. There's the Bhagavad Gita, that's the one that everybody knows, but if you're part of a particular caste, like the highest caste, you're kind of like allowed to read everything. That specific one, everybody gets. But they're all these epic stories about the gods and the things that they did. And if you read those gods, you're like, oh, they're just humans, but bigger and angrier and more beautiful. And like, they're humans, but everything more.
Right.
And then with you, like looking at the Quran, there's written in different eras, and what is written here at the beginning, 30 years later, something was added, and it's like, these don't jive. These are contradictory. These are two different ways of viewing the world. And it was, so there's, and Mormonism, like I've been watching a lot of interviews with different people and listening to, so this is fresh on my mind. So you have the Book of Abraham and then the Book of Mormon, and all of these they're written by usually individuals, or in the case of Hinduism, it's individuals aren't writing the whole thing, but it's all stories about these gods. And all that to say, when you look at the Bible, you're looking at a continuous story that, especially when you get to the New Testament, you're looking at a continuous story, but you're getting like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's perspective on the gospel. And it's okay that they're not, you can't like line them up and they're like this. Like there's different details, different parts of the story come and go. There's emphasis here, where in Matthew emphasizes this and Luke emphasizes this. It's different facets. And then you get to the rest of the epistles in the New Testament, and it's Paul saying, hey, in Corinthia, this is what this looks like. In Ephesus, this is what it looks like. Then you have Peter and John and whoever wrote Hebrews. There's all of these different authors that are pointing back to the same thing. So all I'm trying to get to is there's a consistency in Scripture but it's a consistency of theme and response. It's not okay, you all need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to do this. It's not a whole book that gives you a bunch of rules that you have to do in order to get to heaven, which every other religious text is like, here's what you've got to do to get to heaven. Right. Read this and then do everything that's in it. Mm-hmm. The New Testament is Jesus saying, here is eternal life, here is the kingdom, and the rest of it is, here's how it kind of works out in this context. Here's how it works out in this context. So we don't read the New Testament, and every book gives us a list of 10 rules that we have to follow. Every time we get to a new epistle, it's like, oh, now we have to follow these things. It just keeps pointing back to the one thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's why when we came to Sermon on the Mount and spent time there with the teachings of Jesus, it was very, that was one of those moments where it became even more crystallized, more clear for me that the rest of the epistles of the New Testament, what Paul is calling the church to do is to live in the ways that Jesus has said, my followers live like this. The kingdom of God looks like this.
Yep.
And so when you begin to see it as that, all of a sudden the rest of the New Testament, at least in my experience, was it came alive more so than before, because it was like, oh, that's what Paul's talking about, right? And so when you begin to spend a long period of time in the Gospels and understanding who Jesus was, what he taught, and the reality is Jesus still does say, be obedient to my commands, do what I've said to do, but the expression of it in the rest of the New Testament is the author saying, step back into alignment with the ways of Jesus. You're getting off the path. Like step back into the way, right?
Yeah.
This is what it looks like to live how Jesus has called us to live. And hey, you're off right now. You're not loving each other well, or you've chosen to embrace your flesh, or you've chosen to do something different. Come back. Yeah. And sometimes it's forceful. It's like get out of the road now. Get here now. This is not good. Or and you addressed it this last week. Or you're just going to get what you really are chasing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
destruction's at the end of that road.
Yeah. So. And so I think coming back into Matthew and looking at these things, it's good to, in a sense, slow down enough to read it quickly as one thing, as one story.
Yep.
Slow down enough to go, we're not going to jump into all of the nuance here, because there's some significant moments. But to enter into this story and be like, this is our Jesus. This is what Jesus has done, and look at the ways that people have responded.
Yeah.
Look at the ways that people respond. And guess what? It's not a plan B. It didn't surprise Jesus. And so if it didn't surprise him, the way that he responded was very intentional. Yes. And that's really good to keep in mind.
Yeah. It has to be. That's the thing. Like the way it's all laid out, if none of it was a surprise, then it has to be like it happened exactly as it was going to happen, sort of thing. Yeah. One of the things that I think is beneficial to wrap your mind around when walking through this is you get a chance when you read through the gospel accounts and you see, okay, Jesus in this situation, Jesus in this situation, and this and this and this, and you get to see the continuity of Jesus. But to your point, Mike, you also get to see that the responses, yes, following the ways of Jesus, they're there. But the actual expression of what that looks like, the physical reality of that can look different for different people, different spaces, different time, and realizing that there is a point, there is a main theme, and focusing on the main theme gives you a freedom to be able to just move around and just like operate and do these different things.
Yeah.
That it doesn't you're not stepping into a formulaic sense of unity or uniformity where it's everybody's got to say exactly the same thing and act exactly the same thing and wear exactly the same thing and all of that kind of stuff, where you really do get a chance to express who you are as an image bearer and follow Jesus. You don't get there. You don't get to all of that and the stuff that's more predominantly outlined in like Acts and stuff like that without looking at, okay, so much of what this was about was leading up to this moment. And now how is Jesus going to respond in light of this moment?
I am, as you guys are talking, just the thought that runs through my head is, I think Matthew, maybe this is part of some of what draws you to it. Matthew really does present Jesus as not just a savior, but as a good man that cared about people.
Yeah.
And you see, like, as I just was listening and thinking through Matthew and the whole story and just going like, you know what, if we were listening to Matthew being read at a sitting, and you think about all of the things that Jesus has done, the miracles, the healings, the teachings, everything that he has done that has brought dignity to people on the outside, everything that he has done to show the love of God, and you get to these scenes. And I think it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
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 Like the fact that Matthew just goes right boom to boom to boom to boom to boom. It's like not Jesus.
Yeah.
Like you've spent 7/8 of the book falling in love with Jesus.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's like,
Then you're not given a chance
this,
to
and then this, and
catch
then
your
this.
breath
Yeah.
at all.
It's a tragedy.
Yeah. And my hope is that as we come to it, we would recognize that, and that we would feel the weight of what is going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think when you feel the weight, the joy of Easter is there too.
Yep.
Right? So.
There was I heard an interview a few weeks ago with a man who came out of Hinduism, and it was just, he made such a poignant statement. He said that and he was high up, like one of the higher caste. From the time he was 8 years old, was reading the Vedas and was studying these, and he was in his mid-30s now, and he came to Christ, and he said one of the things that brought him to Christ was recognizing that when he read the stories of the Hindu gods, they're not people you want to emulate. They're not gods that you want to emulate. They're angry, they're jealous, they're constantly messing with humanity. There's a lot of pain that they cause, and they're just above everybody. Like your whole, everything about them is just these fantastic stories, but it usually is the gods doing something that hurts people. And he said, when you're following someone, you should want to follow that person and be like them. And I looked at the Hindu gods, and I didn't find any that I wanted to be like. But I looked at Jesus, and, well, like you were saying, that's you fall in love with Jesus, like the person. You look at him and go, oh, I would like to know that person. I would like to be with that person. Yeah. And so when Jesus comes and says, I am God in the flesh, I am here to show you what God is like, well, yeah, who wouldn't want to follow that God? Yeah. And that was what was so powerful about that. And it was kind of like, he mentioned it once or twice, but in the larger interview, he didn't go back to it. But that was what stuck with me was, that's so huge. Like if you are, if you're out there trying to find which religion is real, well, all of them take a leap of faith at some point. So which God do you want to emulate? Which God is worth following? Which God do you think you would like to walk in the steps of and be like? And that, I don't know how you can look at Jesus and say, oh, maybe not that one.
Maybe not that guy. Yeah, that's good. All right, guys. Well, thank you all for joining us for another edition of Rough Cut Faith. Guys, as always, if you have any questions about anything that we have covered here today, feel free to go ahead and drop a comment. We want to hear from you. We value the interaction, so that way we know what we need to drill deeper into, all of those kinds of things. We also have the time after the service on Sunday for Q&R. You can go ahead and approach Jeremy.
Poor guy. He's like, why does everyone keep talking to me with these questions?
But guys, seriously, you can go ahead and approach anybody on the pastoral team and engage in conversation there. But guys, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you on Sunday.
Woo-hoo. The woohoo was unnecessary.
I think it fit.